Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and it is my great pleasure to be the channel for you this morning, for you to be introduced to the work of someone whose poems speak to the world in so many ways, and someone whose name speaks to his work in so many ways as well. Forrest, let's begin with your name. I've never known another poet with a better poetic name than yours.
Yeah, actually, my last name, Gander, is an adopted name. My mother remarried a man because I was raised by a single woman, and his name was Gander. So it was a rather ridiculous name to suddenly inherit. Everyone in high school started calling me Wood Duck.
I'm going to begin. When we met 2 or 3 months ago in Seoul, and there's obviously that pleasure of meeting as writers with all these books behind us, and that's the identity you have in the world. But I want to begin, since you have an entire hour, by taking all your achievements away from you, and taking all your years away from you. And I'm going to cut your age by half, and let's say you are 21 all over again. I want to learn about, you're just starting out. What is a day in your life like? Where are you? What are you doing? And what are your concerns?
So when I was 21, I had just graduated from college with a degree in geology, and I interviewed with a couple geology companies, but then took a job with the Washington Post. So I was living in Washington, D.C., and bicycling to the Washington Post in the morning. And then at the age of 21, I found out that I had third stage cancer, melanoma. And so my life changed very quickly at the age of 21. And one of the things that I had time to think about lying in the hospital was, if my life was going to be short, what did I most want to do with it? And although I loved geology, I loved writing more, and I decided then that my trajectory would be towards being a writer, whether or not it made me a living, which it barely did.
I didn't know that about you, and that sort of brings a certain resonance to the title of your latest book, Twice Alive, because in a way, when you see the end so starkly when you're so young, whatever you have after that is a kind of second life, isn't it?
It is, and which is what led me to think about also my interest in biology, to lichen. Lichen, the stuff that we see growing all over rocks out in nature, is a very unique plant that in some ways acts more like an animal. And in a lichen, what you get, what probably many of you learned in high school, is you get a fungus that has a life as a fungus, and then you get an algae or a cyanobacteria. And when they come together, they leave the lives that they had and the properties that they had, and become something completely new, functioning in an utterly new way. And as it turns out, according to the one of the most renowned mycologists, fungus studiers in the United States, Anne Pringle, it looks like lichen may not die, that our sense of death, says Anne Pringle, comes from our orientation as mammals. And although you can kill a lichen, you can take a blowtorch to it and kill it. Under ordinary circumstances, given enough light and clean air, a lichen, the original lichen, continues to grow and may not ever die. It may be relatively immortal, which made me think about human intimacy, thinking about two things that come together and are transformed into something else that lives for a long time, that that love is like that human intimacy is like that, and hence the title of the collection, Twice Alive. In fact, part of it is also connected to something that happens in Chandrahas's book called Clouds, which also has, even though it's kind of a love story and kind of a political story and kind of a story about identity and looking for home, it also has an ecological angle to it. There are people trying to, a company that's flattening the top of a holy mountain, and there's a consideration of Hinduism as something that isn't just a religion, but is a way of living in harmony with culture and with nature. And then something, this fascinating thing Chandrahas says, and now I'm not remembering which character says it, is that that mind is less a noun than a verb. And that's what lichen is also. It's a verb. It's two things that are actively making something else. And I think that that's what poetry is. In fact, that's kind of the origin of modernism in poetry, is Ezra Pound and Ernest Fenollosa mistaking the nature of the Chinese character and saying there's no such thing as a noun, that you don't say, there's no abstract noun, you don't say mammal, you say gives live birth, that the character for instance, east, according to Fenollosa and Pound, is the radical for a tree with a sun caught in it. It turns out to be wrong in terms of Chinese language, but the idea that the verb is the essence of being, I love that. And I love that that comes up in your novel, Clouds.
Thank you so much. You write in the epigraph to this book a quote from another writer: a garden without lichens is a garden without hope. I was interested, why does the consideration of lichens take us to such an extreme statement?
Well, because as Cordelia, William Dalrymple's sister-in-law, was noting last night, lichens is an indicator species. So part of the hope of being human beings right now on a planet that's undergoing incredible environmental crisis, unprecedented crisis, is air quality, which is changing. And lichens is one of the first indicators of bad air quality. And in fact, our word, the word litmus, what litmus is a derivative of lichen. So it distinguishes between clean and dirty. So our hope is that we see lots of lichen.
One of the things I've always, although I'm only a prose writer, whenever I try writing verse, it is very bad. But one of the things I always loved about poetry is not only that it cleans up your language as a prose writer because of its compression and intensity, it also teaches you how to see. And I'm going to submit to you just a suggestion. I would love to hear your thoughts on it about when we link up something as small and as dense as lichen to the idea of climate change and ecological crisis. In a way, I would say the work of literature in our age is sometimes when we all know the reasons behind climate change, but it still seems to be very hard to get people to do about it. I would suggest that one of the ways out of this is that what we know from reason, we need to be reminded of again by feeling, by experiencing the world of another life form.
That's right, and that's where another thing, one of the characters in Clouds talks about the necessity for compassion for creatures that aren't just human creatures, and says that it's really hard to distinguish where the human ends and where the world begins, because we're part of each other. The old 19th century philosophies, like Descartes, who said, I think therefore I am, have been proven wrong, that you cannot think except inside a world, in relation with that world. And our thinking is influenced by the world, not just coming from us. That seems really important. And then Chandrahas says that he doesn't write poetry, but his prose is a poet's prose. It is so full of gorgeous language and wordplay and surprise that sometimes you can see that the thinking in his novels happen partly as a kind of leap, a syntactical leap from one sound to another sound, I would say.
Forrest, you're far too generous. Thank you so much. This is making my day as much as speaking to you. Well, I want you to close your eyes now. I'm at the age where I was thinking to myself, I stopped looking at people less and started looking at trees more. It has taken me 40 years of my life to learn how to read, not a book, but a tree. And with that, I need all the help that I can get. And I suspect do so many of us who live in cities. And you write both of forests and of deserts, and I want you to talk a little bit about the contrast between these kinds of environments and what they do to sound and silence, because I imagine that they are very different sonic environments.
Yeah, so the book that will come out next year, Twice Alive, is influenced by Sangam literature, which was a literature that flourished in Tamil Nadu in between 300 BC and 300 AD. And part of Sangam literature is a poetry that connects subjectivity, human feeling, with particular landscapes of southern India. That seems like a kind of model of a way of being in the world, to recognize that what we feel is affected by what's around us. The very notion, as scientists now realize, that there's such a thing as even a tree. There is no one tree. A tree is a system with a mycorrhizal connection underground that sends chemicals and communicates with other trees, with fungi, with vast networks of life, underground and above ground. And it's partly, it's up to humans if we're going to change our sort of disastrous course towards ecological apocalypse, to recognize that we are part of that system. In fact, inside us, this man sitting in the front in this blue shirt, in his stomach, there are parasites that are part of his system. And Suni over here, the beautiful woman in the left, under her armpits, there are worlds of bacteria that are part of her. And in Chandrahas, in his DNA, there's DNA from parasites that long ago became incorporated into the human species. So the notion of racism, or in the United States, the Ku Klux Klan bases their racist beliefs on purity of blood. But there is no purity of blood, and there's not even purity of species. We are an integrated organism, integrated with the world.
Very beautiful, and sometimes it takes poetry to say that and make us feel that. But don't you also feel, I'm very interested to hear thoughts on this, sometimes language is what comes between us and the rest of life that does not speak in the language of culture, it speaks in the language of nature. And sometimes it's when, I feel that way after a run. Your thoughts fade away from you, and you are in a state of silence in which no words exist. And what is that tension in poetry between having to find words to represent the unsayable or to even represent silence?
Yeah, that's a very profound question. I mean, Heidegger talks about this too, that of course language does separate us from things. As soon as we give a name to something, we've limited what it can be. And yet, because we're human beings who derive meaning from language, the reverse is also true, that language is the only way I have of offering my world to someone else. And so, like translation, which is always imperfect, translation is a kind, you can never translate exactly the same meaning from one language to another, even from nature to language. But nevertheless, it's a worthwhile activity. And without the attempt to translate, we're stuck inside a kind of solipsism, a selfness that we can't escape. And that's the worst place to be. And what this notion of silence that Chandrahas has twice asked me about, and I guess I haven't addressed, I think it's the thing that often makes people afraid of poetry. That in poetry, there's all this white page. There's a lot of silence around the words, and that gives the words a particular kind of resonance. And in our culture, which is full of media bombarding us all the time, that sense of silence can be scary. And yet, I think it is our vehicle for connecting in deeper ways with others and with the world. Simone Weil talked about prayer being nothing more than listening and attentive listening. And I think for writers, in fact, I'm interested for you, Chandrahas, for me, writing a poem is a deep listening. And translation is a deep listening. It's less of a scriptural activity, I think, than a spiritual activity. That to translate, I have to disappear with all my noise and all the things I know so thoroughly that I can hear the music in someone else's mind. That's a humble act. That's an act of humility. And I think that's also the act for poets of listening to world and what comes. But what about fiction? Is it that different?
I was interested when you said that, because I think the analog for that in fiction is when, especially as a reader, when the narrator of a novel finds a way to eliminate himself or herself from the text so that you feel you are in communion only with the character which he or she has created.
Yeah.
You elide yourself from the text. And that's a sort of vertiginous but very thrilling encounter where you feel your mind goes away from you and you are in somebody else's head, isn't it? Without that, I just don't think there's any point for literature to exist. I mean, without these connections. And I think what you need is for it not to be marked or highlighted or foregrounded. It's when there's an element of surprise to it, and you fall into that well of someone else's consciousness. It's the same in poetry, that you are taken someplace that you did not see coming.
That's right. And I think certainly in Chandrahas's novel, that's also the sort, that's where empathy comes from. Empathy comes from being able to fully imagine another character, and that's what he's able to create in his art.
Thank you so much, Forrest. Let's stay on your work. This is my work for this hour. I like that you bring up my work, and as a gesture of thanks, I'm willing to accept a gift of a clove from you, should you want to give me one.
I just happen to have some cloves right here.
Well,
They're great mouth cleaners.
While we're having this little writerly exchange, I think it's time for the audience to hear some of your work. So why don't we have your voice and the little video that we've prepared just for this morning. Can you please play that? This is a poem from your new book, Twice Alive, which is not out yet. So this is the first that any audience gets to listen to it?
That's right.
Huh?
doesn't look much like a poem, but it soon will.
To see what's there and not already patterned by familiarity. For an unpredicted whole is there, casting a pair of shadows, manipulating its material, advancing,
assembling enough kinship that we call it life, our life, what is already many lives.
Of its magnitude veiled to us as we live it.
Across the cytoplasm
of adjacent cells
goes a signal that turns you toward me, turns me into you.
We are coupled in quiet tumult.
Convergent arguments.
An alien rhythm becoming familiar.
A rhythm of I am here, never to be peeled away. We are become one thing, listening for what's there and not.
Through the storm, neem trees on the hill stamp wildly in their roots.
We have passed through the spring, but what thing has passed through us?
Now your laughter transparentizes me.
And whose sense of the self doesn't swerve?
Your unconditional foreignness grows conditional.
Stops being foreign at all.
With your nearness, my lens on the world shifts. A peristaltic contraction courses through us as a single wave.
No longer can we keep our distance. Our lips brush, or the tips of ourselves. But what language are you whispering to me?
Your teeth stained by Nilgiri tea, above the trills and whistles in the high limbs,
above the screech of a bulldozer blade shoving rubble
up the wounded street,
above the silence
of an eyeless tick climbing a grass stem. I
understand nothing but the lust your voice incites, the declamatory tenderness.
How and who can say what force has queued up this hour
for our small voices to merge into a carnality that did not exist before now?
Come to this unforeseen conjunction.
We slip into one another. We take hold in a pulse of heat, in a yes and no. For already we can see
we are no longer what we were.
As I find you within me, not fused, not bonded, but lodged.
And for you, is it the same?
The intensity of such investment.
Each of us excited by the volatility of the other, which propels us in a rush as something.
Our lips brush, or the tips of ourselves, stripping away what?
What was before?
Was there even anything before?
The reconfiguration is instantaneous experience.
It is being itself. But whose being now?
Was I endowed with some special pliability so that becoming part of you, I didn't pass through my own nihilation? And what does the death of who you were mean to me, except that now
you are present constantly? Because excess is what it took for us to transform, to effulge. You cast your life beyond itself. Can't you sense me with your ecstatic openness, like rain mingling with red earth? Without you I survived, and with you I live again in a radical augmentation of identity, because we have effaced our outer limits. We summoned each other. In you, I cast my life beyond itself. So it's kind of a love poem for one Ashwini Bhatt, but it's also kind of a poem about lichens.
Forrest, at the end of this book, there's a little essay about Sangam poetry, and reading it, I was thinking, one of the great pleasures of being a writer is, of course, part of it is being a reader, and your work falls in line with that tradition in poetry where a writer encounters a poetic tradition separate from his own, and that without that consolation that there are all these worlds that we don't know from other languages and cultures. One, it's not enough fun to be a writer, and two, it means there's always something so exciting around the corner that you can't see it coming, isn't it? So how did you get to Sangam poetry, and what then made you so attracted to it?
So this is interesting. It's also something that you do in your work, having a character from Orissa. And there's an ethical dilemma in representing characters that aren't your own. Whether you can properly represent them. And I think a writer has to be very careful about representations of other cultures. In my case, with the Sangam poetry, which I learned about through Ashwini Bhatt, and then through reading the fantastic translations of AK Ramunujan and of M.L. Thangappa, I knew that I couldn't enter deeply into a culture so distanced from me by time and space, but that there were elements that in that poetry that touched me very deeply and that excited me, like you said, that turned me on, that made me want to see how my language might reflect some of what inspired me in the language in Sangam poetry. So I'm not calling what I'm writing Sangam Poetics, but I am acknowledging the source, that I didn't come up with this idea alone, but was inspired by an important literary tradition.
Well, this brings us to a word that clearly is of some importance to you, and I have my own thoughts on which I will get to in a bit. But what is eco-poetics? Is it something in itself, or what does it link up to in the poetry tradition?
So there's a curious thing. I don't know how many in the audience, how many of you have heard of eco-poetics. But unlike every other artistic or literary movement that you can think of, which often started in one particular place, usually by a small group of men, and then often in Paris, and then spread, eco-poetics happened in the late 20th century, early 21st century, and took place all over the world at the same time. People were writing with some of the same sense of trajectory and ethical relationship to world outside themselves. And some of the most important writers from the beginning were women. Women like in Denmark, Inger Christensen, in Mexico, Coral Bracho, in Poland, Julia Fridorczyk. And the sense is this: of course, there's always been nature writing, but as the Kashmiri poet Agha Shahid Ali used to say about nature poetry and about one particular famous American nature poet, she goes outside, she sees a dahlia, she has an orgasm, comes inside and writes a poem about it. And that's a relationship to a nature that's constantly separate from you, and one where you're objectifying something outside of you. The idea with eco-poetry is maybe there's a way to write about the world where the human isn't the primary thing from the start, but that the sense of what makes the human is integration with the world. And that's what excited me about the Sangam poetry, and that's what's excited a lot of people who are trying to explore ways of writing about subjectivity that is connected to world, just like that line from your novel.
Okay, I'm going to read bits from two poems, since I consider they have something to flag in front of you, and I would be interested to hear thoughts about them. First, I'm going to read from a Sangam poem, so we go back 2,000 years into time. These are my favorite poems from the Sangam canon. One of the good things about these poems, which are that many of them are in the voice of a particularized speaker. It's not a general lyric voice. In each poem, you see the conditions of the speaker's life, and this clearly is a woman speaking. When my lover wedded me secretly, there was no witness but the cheat himself. If he goes back on his pledge, what can I do? But there stood a heron on slender greenish legs, shaped like a millet's stem, looking for fish in the shallow stream.
I love that poem too. That's the Ramanujan translation, right?
On to Forrest Gander, from your new book. A ground squirrel crossing the dry creek edged with alder, its tail vertical as a flagpole, careens between its burrow and fire caves in the massive redwood trunks, glistening with slug trails, rimmed by rooting mushrooms. They're very different. You cannot replicate a tradition, as you yourself said. They're very different in style. But within these lines, I can see some similarities in that, first, is it the poet's task to create powerful images and original images? And when I see those thin green heron's legs, which is like a millet stem, that's a very powerful kind of connection. And yours, I mean, as soon as you say the squirrel's tail, vertical as a flagpole, just like with Bashir's frog, you make it come alive in that moment, isn't it? I mean, we see the squirrel's tail probably only at that time when you lead us in there.
And the metaphor with the squirrel's tail is to the human world, like a flagpole. And the metaphor in the Sangam poem is that her fragility and vulnerability in that moment makes her think of the heron, the stalking heron. So that kind of going back and forth between human world and world outside of us, which I think can also be city world, that we're not compelled to all live in the woods, but paying attention to the way that the environment around you affects your perception and maybe even your patterns of speech.
One of the things that many people have remarked about your work, and which I found as well, by the way, all the new words I learned from your writing, I put aside in one column in my notebook, and my vocabulary is bigger this week than it was last week. Thank you for that.
Same with me in my notebook with yours.
I want to hear your thoughts on to what extent is it a writer's work, and especially a poet's, language. We use language to represent the world, but language is also force and a kind of energy within itself. To what extent is it your work to use the entire resources available of vocabulary and the English lexicon? But in doing that, does it mean that in going out in these outer reaches of language, you leave some readers behind?
That's a really important question. I'm glad you asked it. And it's true. I think that one of the things that writers can do, because all of us live in a very circumscribed set of daily language use, right? We say the same things to each other, the same responses when someone asks us a question. That what literature can do is to expand the range of language we have access to. And that can make more perceptible to us subtleties of feeling and subtleties of perception. And sometimes, and because I have a geology background, I sometimes use science, but I'm interested in bringing language from everywhere into the work, because even if you don't know in context what a heron is, or what some word that I use is, in the context, you have a sense for it, and it may stir your curiosity. In the context, you can sort of figure out what it is, even if you aren't familiar with it. And that kind of expansiveness, I think makes us bigger human beings. That expanding our lexicon actually expands our range of perception and feeling. That thing that Wittgenstein says that I'm going to screw it up now, but it's basically the world for us is the language we have for it.
I'm interested in childhood, and when is it, I can't remember for myself, so I'm going to ask you, when is it for the first time you realized language is not an exact transcription of the world? Or is it when you have two languages and you realize you cannot jump between them? When you do that, you get into a different place?
Well, that's certainly true, and that's one of the things that so excites me about being in India, because in almost every conversation I hear, there are really about three languages. There'll be a local language, there'll be Hindi, and there'll be some English words, and that resourcefulness, having the capacity to draw language from other languages, seems like a kind of model almost for me, because I think each language presents a different way of seeing the world. In Bolivia, I've translated a great Bolivian poet named Jaime Sáenz. I've co-translated two books by Jaime Sáenz, who is very influenced by the Aymara people. And the Aymara, which is the indigenous population of Bolivia, have a language in which it's impossible to say something like, the last Mughal king died in such and such a time. You cannot structure a sentence that way, because every sentence that you say has to be qualified by whether you witnessed this or you overheard it. And in the Aymara conception of the world, when they talk about the future, they point behind them. When they talk about the past, they'll make sweeping gestures in front of them. And the word for past is the same word as front. The word for future is connected to the word back. And linguists think that in a language where it's so important to testify whether you've witnessed something or you didn't, you place the past, which can be testified to, in front of you where it's visible, and the future behind you because it can't be testified to. So the horror of English, which I guess we're not speaking in Hindi or Canada right now, is that it has displaced so many other languages in the world. And one of the beautiful things about India is that there are so many active languages in conversation with each other. Some anthropologists say the languages in India change every 40 miles.
Where does Spanish come into your life?
Spanish too. You know, in the United States, you can be so satisfied to speak English and not learn another language. And I didn't want to be like that. So I worked really, really hard to master another language and did it on my own. I took one course in college because it was important to me to have another language. And I studied Japanese also. And in that same thing I was telling you about language and its meaning happens in Spanish. A great religious Spanish poet named St. John of the Cross, he'll have a poem that begins, Éntreme donde no supe, y quédeme no sabiendo, toda ciencia trascendiendo. And you could translate it, badly I'd say, as, I entered into unknowing and remained there without knowing, rising above all science. But grammatically, he's beginning with the verb. Instead of like I entered, he's saying entreme. The entered happens first. And that's because he's a Christian, and in the Spanish Bible, in the beginning, in English we say in the beginning was the Word, but in the Spanish Bible, back to this thing that Chandrahas says about the mind, in the beginning was the verb. And so when St. John of the Cross begins his poem with a verb, he's saying, I can't begin the sentence of my own life. God controls my life. God controls this sentence. And that's why we need many languages.
You have translated a number of Spanish writers and Mexican writers into English, and in a way that you allowed them to cross the river of language and to find a new readership. I'm wondering, what is the experience like of working with another poet over a text, and who gets to have final say over what comes up?
Yeah. That's a very good question, too. Is there anybody in this room that also translates, that does some translation? Yeah. Have you worked with living writers? Yes. Uh-huh. So I prefer to work with living writers, but when a living writer has enough English that they can begin to argue with me about, no, I think it should be this, it can become a complicated situation. So you're hoping to have someone that you can communicate with, but who trusts you to do the translation and doesn't try to take the translation over. With dead writers, who I've also translated, it can be more difficult. You can't ask any questions, and so you have to do a lot more research. In my case, whenever I translate a dead writer from another country, I have to travel to that writer's city, I have to meet people that might have known the writer, I have to do a lot more research.
I'm going to, it's only when I published my first book that I realized that one of the great riches of literature, which no one tells you about, they keep it a secret from you, is that when you've written a book, you get to meet other writers, and like with yourself, I mean, like I'm very, you suddenly can leap straight into the essentials of conversation. You don't waste any time, and I think this is one of the great pleasures of being a writer: the chance to meet other people who work in language one-on-one, and to have that head-on encounter, separate from your own books. Yeah. Let's say that tonight, JLF says, like, you can host your own literary dinner party with any writers from all across space and time, and you can invite 5 people.
Just 5? Yeah.
Well, you can think of more, but why don't you give us 5 with a few notes about the people who are most important to you? They may be living or dead.
All right. There's a living writer from Hungary named Laszlo Krasznahorkai, who I think is one of our great writers. He's a stylist. His sentences go on for pages and pages, and yet they're so full of energy that you don't stop them. So that would be one. Dostoevsky was pretty important to me when I was reading Dostoevsky, and just the psychological tension of his work was so important to me. Religious writing, like Andal, the poet who also borrows from Sangam poetry and writes poems of searing, erotic and mystical power. She would be someone, though she's partly mythological, that I would love to meet. Corral Bracho, this Mexican poet, I think she changed poetry in Latin America the way that John Ashbery changed it in America. She would be someone I would want to meet, and I would definitely want Chandrahas to be there.
I was wondering, when the closer you got to 5, if I would have any partner tonight.
We're partying, brother.
Okay, what has been your most exciting friendship in literature? Because I know friendship is very important to you, and I do feel that without someone whom you feel has that secret understanding of yourself, it's why you often get asked as a writer, who's your ideal reader? Do you write for a certain readership? I think you write for one imagined person, often.
Yeah, and sometimes you just write for language and hope that you find a reader. But for me, I had a wonderful friendship with a great American poet named Robert Creeley, who kind of changed American poetry by finding a rhythm that hadn't been written before. So a famous poem of his goes like this. Like I said to my friend, because I'm always talking. John, I said, which was not his name. The darkness surrounds us. And what can we do against it? Unless, and why not? We buy a big goddamn car. Drive, he said, for Christ's sakes, and watch out where you're going. So what he was able to get in those poems is this mind that's revising itself. You hear someone thinking, someone who's so self-absorbed in the case of this poem that he doesn't even remember who he's talking to. And he feels a darkness around him that's like an existential darkness, and what does he want to do? He wants to buy a car to solve it. Very American. And so the speaker responds and says, pay attention to what you're doing. Look where you're driving. And so in a way, it's a political poem that's couched in a particular sensibility that's marked out by a rhythm that's absolutely all Robert Creeley's.
Wonderful, wonderful. Let's have some questions from the audience. We have 7 or 8 minutes for that. How about you and then you, sir? And then we'll go to someone at the back.
Hi, my name is Mandar. You made a very interesting observation about languages and how native languages are getting replaced by English. I certainly don't stand for it. I'm very much an advocate of local languages. But don't you think that there has always been an effort by local cultures and tribes to localize the English language itself?
Which is a wonderful thing, yes. So that you have patois, for instance, and Jamaican English. There isn't one English. There's an Indian English, which is very different from American English. And I think that's a wonderful transformation. It's taking the germ of manifest destiny and transforming it into a different animal. I think that's a fabulous other thing that happens that has both political and aesthetic benefits. Thank you for bringing that up.
Are you constrained by syntax when you look at metaphors and when you look at other languages?
So that's the benefit, I think, of looking at other languages, is that it can offer to you different ways of thinking about syntax, that it sort of expands. I know certainly translating from Japanese and from Spanish has expanded my sense of syntactical possibility. And I think that ends up making English a richer language as it is influenced, as it approaches the qualities of other languages.
Someone else? Well, why don't we have you first and then?
Actually, I'd like to ask that when you said you were diagnosed of cancer, did you have like an existential crisis or something like that?
When what?
When you
When
were
you
diagnosed?
said you were diagnosed of cancer.
Yes, I was.
So like, how did you deal with it?
I was 21 and I had third stage melanoma, and there's only 5 stages. So it was very borderline, and later I lost lymph nodes and I lost my spleen. So I was thinking that my life might be much shorter, and as part of that existential crisis, I took the risk not to choose a job field that I knew would offer job security, because if I had a short life, I wanted to be doing what I was most passionate about, and I would figure out a way to live. Have you had something like that in your life?
No, thankfully not.
I hope you're spared, yeah.
By the way, I'm very impressed with the brevity and the pointedness of all the questions. On the front lawn, they don't ask questions like this. They go on for 2 or 3 minutes about their lives.
Oh,
and
yeah.
stuff. Yeah, the real readers are in this room.
Hi. Forrest, I'd like to ask you about an inscription for one of your earlier books, which says, "No one is stranger than the self, which appears as another and comes to haunt us by accepting, finally, one of many invitations." Now, this is a book which talked about immigration in many ways, and I found this inscription very, very interesting, and I'd just like you to talk a little bit about this.
I think and I imagine many of you in the room share the feeling with me that when you travel, that you become the foreigner, and that recognition of yourself, that what the other offers us is a new way of seeing ourselves, is an invitation to see ourselves outside of all of the things we pad ourselves with so that we are less vulnerable to the world. And I think that invitation that foreignness offers is to become vulnerable again. And I think it's in vulnerability that we find our strengths as human beings. Do you?
You, ma'am. I'll come to you next.
I wanted to ask you something about the Sangam literature. You know, the way we've been taught as children, the stories, the poetry is on heroism, on love, praise of the king. Well, dancers in India tend to pick up the aspect of love. So I'm curious to know what's the alchemy that you worked out, whether it's heroism, whether it's love, praise of the king, or have you brought out something which is your interpretation and you've combined the three?
Well, so the tradition, as you know, with Sangam poetry, as you're saying, there's really two different major styles. And it's the Puram, that is the sort of war poetry and the praise the king poetry. And it's the other that interests me more, which is, as you say, the love poetry. And that's where I've focused. And it's not just love poetry, it's jealousy poetry, it's all the human emotions poetry. There's something that Ezra Pound says that I really believe, that no matter how smart we are as writers, that what endures is emotion. And when we read poems from the Sangam from that long ago, or from Sappho in Greece, who wrote in a language that disappeared from the earth over 2,000 years ago, that we can feel something from that long ago is as much of a miracle as I can imagine experiencing.
What about you then? Yes, and we'll come to you after that.
Hi, I was curious about how you read a poem or approach a poem, especially because you spoke of poetry of different languages. How do I look at a poem and not sort of let my cultural baggage sort of overplay, or should I even call it baggage in the first place?
Well, there's no way of looking at the world without our cultural baggage, but I think that's the magic of empathy and of literature, is that good literature gives us someone else that has a different cultural baggage, and that we can begin to imagine that other person who is so different from us, and yet who we feel some relatedness to. So I think there's no way of stepping out of your skin to be someone else. And yet, unless we try to do that, unless we're enticed to do that, then we're stuck inside ourselves forever. And you know, how can a woman even write about a man? She can't be a man. How can a man write about you know, someone from a culture different from his? Unless we take that risk, we don't develop the empathy that makes us more deeply human.
Absolutely. This is turning into a very good discussion.
No.
I was wondering if you could expand on kind of like the spontaneous nature of eco poetics. Like, do you think it's more likely we're going to have more spontaneous creations of different thematics in poetry? Is that like a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And what would you predict would be like the next great thing that you'll see in literature?
Yeah, that's it. No one's ever asked me that. That's a good question. I should ask you that in response. But The thing about eco-poetry is it came about in the time of the World Wide Web. So instead of waiting for something to develop in one place and gradually spread, it was able to sort of happen everywhere at once with people watching because of translation in part. And also because everyone alive in the world now is experiencing this crisis of global warming and of the extinction of species as well as the extinction of languages, that some scientists are saying it's too late to save the seas, the creatures in the seas. We're in, a terrible moment in the history of human life on this planet, and a lot of people feel responsible for writing to that moment. And that's happened no matter what culture and language they're using. And what do you think then? Like, for me, it's like, just are we going to survive this? So that there will be a writing after this. What do you think?
I mean, definitely we need to survive the apocalypse. That's an important part. I guess something I always kind of thought is interesting is like the idea of your own cultural lens. Like in nature, they talk about like a poet should be like a floating eyeball and just taking everything in. In my personal philosophy, I think like, your eyeglass, your glasses are just as important. So I kind of wonder if, as we move towards more like an interconnected global world, if we're going to have more reflection on that, or kind of like how the us versus them, that type of idea is going to unfold.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's been the trend of philosophy, is towards what they call intersubjectivity. I think you're right. I think you've made a good prediction.
A good prediction. One last question, perhaps. Yes, why don't we? Right up here in the front.
What advice would you give those who aspire to be writers?
To write and to read, that writing comes out of reading. Cormac McCarthy says, books are made from books. And the one other thing is that it's a hard path. There'll be lots of rejections and lots of failure. And your heart has to be strong enough, big enough, to get through all those closing doors and to keep going. Because if it's not, then you'll be one of the billions of writers who stopped writing. So you keep going.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if there was ever a chance for all the poetry and passion of literature to be packed into an hour, that was with Forrest Gander. So let's give our guest a very big hand.
And to Chandrahas, my friend.
Forrest will be signing copies of his books right after, so I suggest you take a gander home.
Thank you very much for joining us at this session that was sponsored by Dainik Bhaskar, and thank you again to our speakers, Forrest Gander and Chandrahas Choudhury. And like Chandrahas just said, they will both be signing their books in the book signing tent, which is out of the venue and round to the left. Thank you.
Teamwork Arts takes India's artistic diversity to the world across continents, traversing from Australia, Canada, China, Egypt, Germany, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Africa, Russia, South Korea, Sweden, UK and the USA in its stunning array of 16 international festivals in over 40 cities.